Good morning. I'm Marguerite Benson. I'm one of the founding members of Marvin's Angels, and I'm thrilled to welcome today our distinguished podcast guest, Dr. Jonathan Teubner, startup founder and CEO. And he has a fascinating background as a scholar and an academic with very global experience. So we're thrilled to be able to speak with you today, Jonathan, about your experience. And so would love to kind of kick things off with a couple of sort of rapid fire questions. So first off, what's the name of your company and how would you describe it in one sentence?
Well, it's great to join you here on this podcast. Thanks for having me on. The company name is Filter Labs. What we do, I guess, is like the one like buzzy sentence we have about it is we do freakonomics for info ops, and so we bring together a lot of like crazy data to see insights at a local level that people aren't. When you start to look at like people are buying mustard or milk as well as complaining about certain things online.
Fantastic. So how would you describe the problem that you're specifically looking to solve with Filter Labs?
So we solve the problem of like certain things around data sparsity or data absence. And so that's where we kind of marshaling alternative data and kind of fusing it with some more standard data, bring insights for that localized level where maybe the data just doesn't exist or is kind of sporadic. And so that's where like a lot of people, like our customers that we basically work with, want to know things, and they know that there's got to be some kind of way to get that without putting people in place in there. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the other trick of it is how do you get information on a local level without actually sending people there?
Very cool. So our final kind of rapid fire question would be when you think about Filter Labs and kind of the product and service that you're providing, how do you differentiate yourselves from other folks in this space?
Well, I guess we kind of increasingly think of ourselves along like two ways. Like, what are we designing as like a fundamental technology there, and how is that differentiated on the market of like other tech companies and within basically the kind of realm of startups
Mm-hmm.
they're developing, and like we're obviously a part of a larger ecosystem there, as well as what we do for customers. So on the customer facing side, really what we have our like, kind of mark here is bringing together what people are saying online with the behavioral data, the stuff about economic consumption data, as well as like social indicators. Like I said, marriage, divorce, crime rates, and things like that. Putting it all together and applying some of our data fusion modeling to kind of understand the relations between these pretty heterogeneous data. On the technology side, really the technology that we're building that is unique is we're making much more efficient processes and kind of automating processes that require right now a lot of manual intensive labor. And that's stuff people have to go out and find kind of, automating the data discovery process,
Mm-hmm.
building like auto classifiers for it such that you can create scalable structured data feeds out of unstructured data that's highly dispersed web data.
Wow, you just gave us a lot to dig into right there. And that's what I'd love to do. So, one of the things that you touched on here is how what people say and espouse does not necessarily align with their actual behavior. And that's, I think, one of the challenges sometimes with the surveys. And of course, here in the U.S., we're already really in kind of political campaign season and thinking a lot about survey data. So can you tell us a little bit more about kind of what is your take on that tension that you can sometimes see between, what someone says about their attitudes or beliefs and then kind of the actual behavior on the ground?
Yeah. So what we tried to do, I mean, you can't discount what people tell a pollster or tell or go on and say online. I think there's sometimes a certain level of naive rejection of that, but you have to understand what it's telling you.
Mm.
isn't always straightforwardly what you think it is.
Hmm.
And so they are communicating something. What we try to do is kind of pair what people are like the self-reporting, whether that's in a kind of something like a survey instrument or something more of kind of what they're saying online with what we would say like the revealed preferences of behavior.
Hmm.
So that, okay, they're going online and complaining about one piece, but they're doing something else. And such that when they, like, for example, in Russia, we found this very tight correlation between when they would go on and they had concerns and they, it was obviously the war wasn't going well for them. And they wouldn't go on and complain about the war itself. They'd go on and complain about the draft, particularly. That
Mm.
correlated with a lot of other indicators that were leading to people leaving Russia. And so it's
Hmm.
that we found that when people, like right around the same time people were complaining about the draft, they were also taking their pets to the vet and then to like get them like fully vaccinated and maybe even get them a doggy passport. And then that led in these areas to people leaving, and such that like they were like there's a big deep concern there that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have just seen if you just looked at what they were saying online. And this is kind of the sense of like social listening tools are good and we should keep using them, but they're not sufficient alone.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. You need that complementary data to really kind of get that full, more accurate picture. Another thing that you mentioned is, your focus is really where there's data sparsity. And I think a lot of what we hear about nowadays, especially in conversations around artificial intelligence, is that there's so much data. And how are we going to actually leverage all this? Do we have enough computing power? Are we making enough advances with machine learning, let's say? So you're kind of tackling a little bit of a different challenge. And so tell us a little bit more about kind
Yeah.
of that difference.
Well, I mean, among the many inequalities that we exist within our world is something we might call data inequality, such
Mm.
that there are some areas that have really rich data about that area. Manhattan, we know an awful lot about Manhattan. Twitter data even can like you can get accurate like understandings of like population trends out of Twitter in Manhattan. That's not true for virtually any other place other than maybe San Francisco, or DC rather, as well, about like Twitter's representational value. It's really weak there because it's just like the penetration is low and then it doesn't really, there's not enough people in areas. So even within America, a very data rich place, probably one of the most data rich places, part of that has to do with our data privacy laws being a little bit weaker.
Hmm.
Those, we see that between Manhattan and my hometown in Oklahoma, where I was born and raised. It was like those are you're going to get very different things. So you already have a kind of vast difference between those two as well. But if you then think about it, when you go into other parts of the world, one problem like the data sparsity that we're kind of working around right now, we're tracking a lot of information around the Israeli Gaza war, and
Mm.
Gaza itself is just a black hole.
Yeah.
There's no
Hmm.
data there, and such that there's nothing to bring out. Some of that has to do with just what happens in war, and the ways that Israel is shutting down their telecommunication system. But even before that, there wasn't a lot of data to pull out. And such that if you think about that, there are these places around the globe where there's just not as much data, and such that what there's of course a lot to solve with large language models and what their kind of the data environment that they presume. But also, there is this really significant problem that sometimes emerges in that context, talking about the bias of the data, that
Mm.
it's all just a bunch of like white dudes. talking, and that data just so like all the models are trained to like really like how a white dude would respond.
Right.
Whereas like if you think about that on a global level, we're like, even if we solved that problem within America, we'd still be losing out on perspectives that are in the global South and Africa and South America and parts of Asia. So that it is a completely different problem to solve, but one that I think eventually hooks up with these kind of more fundamental issues that are much discussed in the United States right now.
Fantastic. Well, this is a great segue to hear a little bit about kind of you've already talked us through some of these really thorny challenges that Filter Labs is helping to address. So can you tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to start a company? You were an academic, you're doing amazing research abroad. Where was this aha moment that you wanted to build Filter Labs?
Yeah, so I guess it kind of came in stages. I was I was a faculty member at the University of Virginia, running this like program that was a collaboration between the Data Science Institute and the Department of Religious Studies. What we were trying to do was use some kind of natural language processing techniques to understand community level sentiment and kind of discourse in Lahore, Pakistan. And so a lot of the tools that we were kind of used to using in the United States, like going online and getting social media data and trying to like filter it down for the geolocated data to see like what people are care about in this area, just weren't available. It's just like, yeah, there's some evidence of some people active Twitter use, some Facebook accounts certainly there, but they really didn't get down there, and we really couldn't figure out what are these religious communities in Lahore, just as like this magnificently like rich and intellectually vibrant part of the world, really more so than I think like many Americans really realize. The confluence of cultures there that have like led to just like a great literary environment. So these communities were very sophisticated in this. So how can you get this out of there? And so we started to like figure out like what are some ways to start to like find these alternative communities and figure out what they're kind of like how they're relating to each other, how they're relating to a set of issues when we weren't relying on social media. So we were kind of doing that, and after that I ended up getting recruited and went to a different university in Australia actually, and then was there, ended up in Germany. And when I was kind of living in Berlin, I thought, well, maybe there is an application for this. I think this was around 2020 initially, when I thought, well, let's try this out as an alternative way to do some like some stuff in the United States. Tooled around with that, but really kind of the moment that really kind of like changed everything for us was when we realized what we were doing was initially building social listening tools that weren't reliant on social media platforms.
Right.
And so the initial use case that really kind of like sharpened that for us was when Russia cut off Western social media, and such that like people then needed to know what was going on in Russia. And the tool that they used was too tightly scoped to Western social media platforms using that data. So how else are we going to do that? And that kind of led us to this realization within that type of information environment that you were going to need some other types of signals to understand how to interpret this, to see what they're not saying, but they might be thinking or believing there. And so that was really critical for us. And it was, it wasn't just like one thing, the divine didn't just import the whole vision directly into my head at one moment, which sometimes feels like when you're talking to other founders or listening to them, you're thinking like, wow, like it seems like they just like got the whole thing all at once.
Right.
And it was like, for me, my experience was like, well, I figured this piece out, they were doing it, and then we realized we needed this other piece too.
Hmm.
And, a couple of years down the road, it was like, okay, yeah, we think we have something like a product. We were very fortunate to have investors that kind of allowed us to go through that process. And I think often founders are, conjuring up these stories to try to convince investors that
Right.
they've got a fully formed idea.
Well, it's fascinating how well, and actually very relatable then in kind of how you developed the hypothesis around Filter Labs as a company, because it was very much this multi-phase process and really bringing together a lot of kind of your experiences over time. And I think recognizing that there is still such a challenge in getting these hyper localized insights. I think we tend, that kind of the layperson tends to think, oh, we have social media and all this rich data to access kind of across the globe, and unfortunately, that's not really the case. And so you're providing that kind of niche expertise in how to kind of take a creative approach toward these sorts of issues.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about it is that we don't have even distribution of data
Hmm.
across the world, that we have these places where there's a lot of data. And there's actually areas of our life there's a lot of data. Then there's areas of our life there's very kind of little data. And so if you want to use data analytics to try to understand cultural, social, even personal aspects, you're going to have to even those out. Because what we're
Hmm.
doing is we're conjuring up very narrow views of ourselves, very narrow views about like what a society or culture wants to, kind of, or their view. And that's a real danger at any point in time in relying on data in this respect,
Hmm.
is that it is a reduction. And it's a reduction just in the process of getting it into something that we might point to and say, yeah, that is that is data. Also, what gets into that kind of narrows it down. So we have to be very cognizant of what it's like doing to us epistemologically. We
Mm,
can't be convinced that it's that we're getting the same thing when we walk through a neighborhood and experience it. Data
right.
doesn't give us that.
I love that point because it reminds me of my time as an analyst in government, where there is thankfully a pretty solid recognition that data alone is insufficient to really understand a given issue or topic and to make a decision based on that. And I think we often focus on being data driven, I think, nowadays, which is fine to a point because the data alone is insufficient. You need that enriched context and additional information, which I know you focus on very much with what Filter Labs is doing. So that really resonates.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like it's always understanding with anything, and this is maybe the academic in me coming out. Like we always have to understand the limits
Hmm.
of our analysis, the limits of our tools, and like it's kind of understanding that those are really important, particularly when you're working in high stakes environments.
Right.
And so you have to realize that. And what we try to do is build tools that, yes, expand those limits
Hmm.
a little bit, but also tools that are very like at least in the team that's building are very aware of the limits of them. And we're like, and I think once you like see the limits of it and you start to articulate those, you actually it's easier to like enter into other people's workflows
Hmm.
there. It's easier to kind of see how they might be used appropriately. And you want your data, you want your product to be used the right way, because that's where it's going to be best and that's where you're going to have the best customer retention. Anyway, so
Sure.
it doesn't make much sense to try to convince customers that your product or your data is telling you something it's not, because
Hmm.
they will eventually become wise to it.
Well, I love that's a great way to kind of illustrate how you're being a scholar and an academic has helped inform how you view your role as a founder, especially working with data and all its complexities. And come across all that many startup founders with your kind of background. So that's really neat to hear how that comes into play with your thinking. So we've heard quite a bit about kind of your journey thus far. Let's talk a bit about kind of where you're going and what you're thinking about in the kind of the next couple of years. So given you've had some great success since Filter Labs got started, you mentioned really it being 2020, which was kind of a galvanizing year for you. So it's not really been that long, but you've had this great initial success. So what are you thinking about in terms of goals and milestones that you're looking to achieve in the next, 3 to 5 years? What are you most excited about?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's like some of the things that, for us, what we're kind of what we're kind of working on, and this is, kind of feels like it's all day right now, is really expanding a lot of these tools into, kind of non-traditional areas. Like I said, we're doing work around, Israel, Gaza. What that's kind of pushed us into is getting up our Arabic language tools to be able to use across the whole region. We were just tracking some things last night in Jordan and about the kind of the pressures under King Abdullah there, in Jordan, looking, and so then like moving out into Africa and all these others. And I guess that's kind of like where it's exciting, is always like being at that point of like, let's go and try to find a place that's really hard to understand. Let's see if we can bring that on. It's like having those challenges there. And so what we were kind of what we were for a while was kind of something like a niche company. Like we did for a while, and we made our mark in doing stuff in Russia. But really, to be like a company, to be something that was, we kind of needed to like expand beyond that. And so we were kind of toying around, was like, okay, let's go tackle China, or let's, tackle India. And I think the decision we made over the last few months was, let's go global. Let's take this and just go do everything we can. And so we've just like tooled up, and it's like brought this real excitement and energy to the company as to like, okay, what are we doing next? What are we going to bring on? Again, what are the insights that we're looking at? What are like, how can we do that there? And we're just, so it's been very exciting to see that come on. There are also other use cases that are kind of coming into view. We have mostly worked within what we might call, in the government space, we might call like the info ops sort of world. And we've also kind of worked with people that aren't in the government side of those things. We're doing communications, campaigns, political campaigns in the US. So now we're kind of moving into areas where bringing on this kind of alternative data, where sometimes in high volume markets that just don't have as much coverage, or the tools aren't as kind of widely accessible for kind of financial use cases and things like that. So kind of expanding those a little bit. And some of that had to do with the backers of our recent round came from that space. And so we have been in conversation with them for kind of doing that. So those are kind of two things, I think, that they're not exactly at that 5-year time frame, but it's somewhat kind of sooner there. At the 5-year time frame, it's really hard to say where this will be, but well, any founder wants it to be stabilized by that point. And but it's been a very exciting few months, actually, and we kind of see that kind of rolling forward pretty rapidly into the next 2 years at least.
Great. Well, it sounds like you've really been able to make strides in kind of your first couple of years, and kind of capitalizing on what folks are interested in, Russia, Ukraine, now the Middle East, but kind of your global vision, is super exciting, given that then kind of determine based on kind of what customers are telling you, what investors are telling you, product market fit questions. I can see how that will enable you to be a bit more agile and kind of what you're focusing on. So that's super exciting to hear about.
Yeah.
We'd love to touch on a couple of kind of founder focused questions. And everybody always wants to know, like, what have you learned? What's been a kind of a key takeaway from your experience thus far building up Filter Labs, and that you would share with others?
I guess the one thing I learned, and maybe I kind of learned it the hard way early on, was the best way to build a product, the best way to kind of do a lot of that isn't in secret away from the customer, is actually with the customer. And being like very much much more aggressive early on of not like selling to the customer, but just engaging there. And I think that was one was like, oh, I gotta go, like, you gotta go pitch this to investors, you gotta get your kind of pre-seed money, you gotta go build the thing, and then you got to go get a seed round, and then you go and try to find customers for what you built, right? It's actually kind of like, any founder who's like made it through will know that that's like, it's the sequence there is all sounds very pretty, but it's not reality.
Right.
Was that like, so I think, maybe this was just someone coming from out of academia, where we do like have questions, we design tools, we build things, we answer questions, we study things, and then we like see like, oh, who in the world, wants this? It's how you protect academic integrity that way, freedom of inquiry and all these other things. But actually, when you're kind of wanting to develop a product for use in like a commercial use or a government use case, you need those people very early on in the process. And how to do that, how to get them involved with it isn't always straightforward, because each of these people are, their competing interests. There are obviously limited time to spend with this, like, whatever startup wants to do something. And I think that's kind of like the secret art of the founder, is trying to like go get those people, those customers into the process early enough such that you don't make too many of that type of mistakes about building something no one wants. And that's the worst mistake. That of course you can be building things that like no one knows that they want yet, but that's a really hard thing to do. And that takes a very special type of kind of product type of market, if you're going to be doing, kind of those things. So not only like the frontier of technology, but the frontier of desire, which is kind of like a strange place to be. But
I think I'm going to reuse that phrase, frontier of desire. It's a good one. Well, and so with that challenge, like, what did you find worked well for you in terms of, you want to be iterating with this really early customer. So, how did you approach that?
What we ended up doing was, there are a few things. We kind of joined some like just research projects. So you're like, here's our data, you can have it and you can publish with it. We'll like this, all very straightforward. We know how to do that in academia, just to try to like get things out there. And those are like ones where you're kind of seeing like a government entity would fund some research over there and we could be a part of that. And so that was kind of maybe something from my particular academic background, like being familiar with these ways of engagement with someone like a government user, that you might see like, oh, okay, they're going to be a part of this and we can kind of like be there, and we're going to be giving up, obviously, the researchers aren't really going to pay us, and we're not at the point that the government's going to do much for us, but they're going to maybe help us on some of those schemes. So that was very helpful. The others that we did was just kind of enter into like partnerships with people. Say, okay, you're trying to solve this, like we'd like to do it. We were able to do that very early on in a couple political campaigns. in the midterms, the Wisconsin Democratic Party allowed us to kind of help, kind of like start to build this stuff about like how can we get some alternative, you know, metrics working in Wisconsin to figure out like what's this difference between these not only like congressional districts but below that at the state senate and house level there, and such that. So that was really helpful just to kind of like find those environments where we could like we knew if a political campaign like found some insight in this, another type of communications effort and info ops is also going to find great. So like finding those ways to say like, what's the nearest use case where we can have a really meaningful partnership there, and we can learn that. And some of that is like thinking about the space is like who's like who uses it the same way, things like that. So and then once you kind of get a little bit of you have some work out there, you've established yourself a little bit, it's just a little bit easier to work with. And so that's where we kind of now have more like formal partnerships of like new stuff we're bringing online, which make better economic sense for the company, of course. But you do a lot, and this is maybe just like the absurdity of a founder. You do a lot that you're going to be like you're just losing a lot of money over. Right. And but you really think that if this went well, this could roll into something else. And that's that's wishful thinking, of course. But there's no founder who isn't like just completely drenched in wishful thinking.
Very aspirational. You have to be. I love that. The absurdity of a founder. Yeah. So Jonathan, there's so much more we could discuss, both about Filter Labs and about your journey thus far and what's ahead. Unfortunately, we can't fit all that in to our time together today. So I just wanted to kind of open it up a little bit to you. Anything else you'd like to share that we didn't have a chance to discuss that you think might be of interest to folks listening to the podcast?
Nothing that immediately comes to mind, but I guess just to kind of go back to like the discussion about the uneven distribution of data. I think we also have this uneven distribution of technology right now, not only within kind of globally, but also just within sectors. And I think like one of the hardest things to do right now is to like, particularly in this funding environment, is to design like technology for places that actually need it, that don't have it. And those are often places where the demand signals aren't quite strong yet, or even the markets aren't going to be considered like venture backable type markets of figuring out like how to go forward. And I guess that's one thing that like I've been thinking about pretty regularly is we were very fortunate, and I think any founder, when he or she is being honest, would say like we feel kind of lucky to have made it through a couple of difficult like early stages and with like good backing, but a lot of people can't do it. It's because they're trying to do something that's important. And how do we like figure out that piece? It's still kind of like the one that's like, maybe this is just the academic, the idealist in me, of thinking like, oh, we should be able to build technology for people who actually want it. But it's hard because we need resources, and those resources also want returns, and those returns are going to be found in probably serving the markets who already have a lot of technology. Right. And so I hope that our generation can figure out some way out of that trap. I don't know if we can, to be honest, but that's what I hope we can do.
But your optimism will overcome. Those are fascinating questions to think about. You've definitely given me a lot to consider, especially regarding that kind of uneven distribution of both data and technology.
Will you all invest in companies?
Yeah, well, we
Yeah.
should definitely continue this conversation, maybe
Yeah.
offline. Wonderful. Well, Jonathan, would love to hear your recommendations. If we've got listeners who want to know more about Filter Labs, want to be able to stay abreast of your work, what would you suggest for folks who want to learn more?
Obviously, you can reach out to us through our website, filterlabs.ai. You can also, we have a newsletter there that kind of we regularly post things. We did a colleague of mine at the a filter, and I just published a piece in a magazine on like why fact checking has failed to arrest propaganda. So we're always kind of like thinking about these like bigger pictures about like how we're going to be doing things and like being a part of that conversation. We're always just and wanting to grow that piece of it, and so that's often like the best way to initially kind of get into it. And those would be kind of the ways also to just start to learn more about what we do and how we do it. We acknowledge that we're a bit of an odd company, that we're a bit of an odd culture too. But those are good ways to get in touch with us and follow us, what we're doing. And obviously there's the social media stuff, which obviously talking about the ways in which we don't like, we're trying to get around our reliance on it. Yeah. Follow us.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Jonathan, for joining us today. Really enjoyed the conversation and hearing about the fascinating and really important work that you're doing at Filter Lab. So thanks again.
It's been fun. Thank you for having me on, Marguerite.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. All right. Bye.
Bye.